Good evening, friends, and welcome. Welcome to the 2014 Bechtel Lectures at Conrad Grebel University College. I'm Jim Pankratz, Dean of the College, and I'm glad to welcome you on behalf of the faculty and our College President, Susan Schultz-Huxman. These are major events in the life of this college and in this community. This year, we often comment at the beginning of events that we're celebrating 50 events to celebrate our 50th anniversary this year, which we are celebrating. We have quite a combination of events, but these are two of them, and I don't know, that gets us up somewhere into the 40s, I think. And we like to mention that, but it's also a reminder to us of how many things can happen during the course of one school year, especially one in which you've added so many activities to celebrate the wonderful legacy of this college. And this room that we're in, I remember the first time I came into it years ago when I was studying at McMaster, came and visited here, and I was just so amazed by this room, by the light, by the stone, by the light coming through the windows. So it's been a wonderful place to welcome people over many, many years. So glad to have you with us tonight. The Bechtel Lectures are dedicated to Mennonite and Anabaptist studies. Since the lectures were established in 2000, we've heard historians, sociologists, anthropologists, biblical scholars, theologians, and novelists. They've explored political ethics, peace theology, restorative justice, science, migration, the relations between Mennonite settlers and First Nations people. They've taken us beyond Canada to Russia, Paraguay, and to the global Mennonite community. Last evening we learned about the Amish, primarily based in the United States, but some here. Tonight we're going to learn about Low German Mennonites. So over these 14 years it's been a very, very rich feast. And fortunately we can look forward to more in the years ahead. As many of you know, and as your program indicates, these lectures are here because of the generosity of Lester Bechtel. He helped to establish these lectures and has sponsored them since they were inaugurated. He and his late wife Dorothy, who was chair of the Grebel board for some years, were strong supporters of the college and had a vision, a far-sighted vision and hope for these lectures. Their hope was that the lectures would interpret and communicate Anabaptist Mennonite story to the public, that they would make the research of scholars accessible to the broad constituency, build bridges of understanding between the scholarly community and the constituency and the church. As you know, that's part of our identity, that's part of our rationale for being here at the college. So we thank Lester very much for helping us to fulfill our mission and to serve the community in this way. And I expected to see him being here welcoming you and being right here in the front seat, but I don't see him here. If he comes a little bit later, he'll be here at the reception, and then please offer him your thanks as well. Our lecture tonight has an audience beyond this room. As some of you know, over the past few years, we've started to video these lectures, sometimes simulcast them, but mostly video them and videotape them, and then put them onto our website. And so if you want to hear this lecture again, you can do so. If some of you are watching for the first time, I welcome you wherever you are and whenever it is you're watching. We also publicize these lectures through our Conrad Grebel Review. These lectures have been published there for years. And that also is available on our website. You can go to our website, find the Conrad Grebel Review, and read recent and past issues. It's also available through some scholarly portals, but you can also come to our library and pick up an actual copy of it and hold it in your hand and read it and then put it back. And if you really enjoyed holding it and reading it, you can subscribe to it. And it'll come right to your house. And you can pick it up and hold it and read it. And you can hold it as long as you want. And if you misplace it, there's no fine. So, enjoy it here, enjoy it on the web, enjoy it through Conrad Grebel Review. These lectures are available to you and to a very wide audience. Now this year, very pleased to be welcoming two leading Mennonite scholars to present these lectures. Last evening, Steve Nold from Goshen College described how Amish people and culture are interpreted in North America and how they understand themselves and their place within that cultural context. And tonight, Royden Loewen will introduce us to the Low German Mennonites, whose identity is shaped by their life in Canada, but also their life in Latin America, and sometimes, again, by their life in Canada. I'm pleased to invite my colleague, Professor Marlene Epp, herself a highly regarded scholar of Mennonite history, to introduce Professor Loewen to us, and then to tell you that after the lecture there will be a time for a discussion, after which a reception. I'll say more about that later. Please, Marlene.
Good evening and welcome. I'm very honored to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Royden Loewen. Roy holds the chair in Mennonite Studies and is also professor of history at the University of Winnipeg. He is the editor of the Journal of Mennonite Studies, and he also edits a book series on immigration and culture at the University of Manitoba Press. His research interests focus mainly on Mennonite immigration and more recently environmental history, and I can say with confidence that he is highly regarded by historians in those fields around the world. He is the author and co-author of 8 books, including most recently Village Among Nations, Canadian Mennonites in a Transnational World, published by University of Toronto Press just a few months ago. He's recently completed a draft of his next book, based on oral history interviews, and it is titled Horse and Buggy Genius, Listening to Old Colony and Old Order Mennonites. Most recently, he has embarked on a new study, a global project to explore the relationship of Mennonites with the land in 7 distinct places on Earth: Indonesia, Siberia, Bolivia, Zimbabwe, the Netherlands, Iowa, and Manitoba. Ask him about that one later. Among his books, he is co-author with his Bechtel lecturer colleague, Steve Nold, of the 5th volume in the Global Mennonite History series on North America, titled Seeking Places of Peace. Royden is returning here after being the Rod and Lorna Sawatsky Visiting Scholar at Conrad Grebel in 2007, 2008. Most recently, just this past fall, he was a visiting fellow at Clare Hall at the University of Cambridge in the UK. Well, I could go on, but I won't. When he is not writing books, Royden is a farmer working the land in the Steinbach Blumenort area of southern Manitoba. He is married to Marianne, who also teaches at the University of Winnipeg, and they are the children of 3 adult children. Welcome, Roy.
Thank you very much, Marlene, and thank you, Jim. And Marianne's in the audience here, so I'll try to impress her. It's an honor to be here. It's always just great coming to Conrad Grebel. I think I've noted this before, that my very first academic conference was one here. I attended in 1973 as an 18-year-old student, sent to hear the venerables like Frank Eben, Rodney Swatsky, and others wax eloquently about why Canadian patriotism is good and why U.S. patriotism is bad. Anyway, that was my conclusion of that conference. Actually, not what they said. My task tonight, self-given, is to take you on a field trip, recounting the central challenges in writing the book, Village Among Nations, that Marlene mentioned here. A history of the Low German Mennonite migrations between 1916 and 2006. So, how does one write the history of a people like the Low German Mennonites who simply go against the stream? The by now almost classic Mennonites in Canada series by Frank H. Epp and Ted Regier announce a particular Canadian historical trajectory merely with their subtitles. Separate for the people till 1920, survival for the tumultuous 20s and 30s, and finally transformed for the post-World War II period. The Mennonites in Canada series marked an exquisite trajectory we as historians call modernization, a version of the old sociological paradigm of Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft, the anthropological model of from the closed to the open, or to revert to the particular reigning Canadian history paradigm that Jeremy Weave and other guys have to know if they want to get their PhDs in history, one honed by the foremost Canadian historian Ian MacKay. It is the rise of the liberal order. That is small L, liberal order. That is the ascendancy of the individual over the community, the full triumph of capitalism over pre-industrial moral economies, of course, in seasoned form, that is one that allows for a Gramscian critique strong enough to register and bother, but never threaten in any significant way. Call it liberal, call it Gesellschaft, call it open. The story of Mennonites in Canada has little room for the conservative, the communitarian, the closed. And yet there they are, 250,000 Canadian and Canadian descendant, Low German-speaking Mennonites with some experience in Latin America, mostly Old Colony, who do not fit this model. And yet there they exist in such large numbers they are hard to ignore. They balked the very unfolding of a progressive, modern Mennonite mindset evident in the history of the majority of Mennonites, nor do they politely sit in the shadows of our largest cities, as our friends the Old Order and the Amish do, to remind Canadians or Americans of a pristine and innocent past lost in a shuffle towards modernity. In fact, they insist they are part of the Canadian story, even as they hone a new identity of a village among nations. I remember all too well a moment of utter discomfort when I sat down with the senior elder of the Alt-Bechtel Church at Lacrete in far northern Alberta to interview him for the book Steve and I were writing for the Global Mennonite History series. He asked why I wished to interview him, and I said with a sense of high moral purpose that Steve and I were insisting on including the old orders, the plain people, the traditionalists in our book, whereupon the officer said, "No thanks. We don't want to be part of your story." And then, too, there are all those old colonists who historically have had their Canadian passports, and need them too, who want to be able to come to Canada seasonally, as it suits them, but escape to Mexico when the weather turns cold and or enough money is earned. And of course, this has been their history over the last century. They madly resisted modernization by refusing the terms of the 1916 school legislation in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and then immigrating from Canada to Mexico and Paraguay in the 1920s, when they didn't get their way, speaking of finding freedom in heathen lands, their words, and then didn't go away, in fact returned in large numbers even before the end of the first decade. And then during the 1930s, they hinted they might come back en masse, protesting Mexico's school closures, vainly hoping, innocently, naively, that Canada might have seen the light since 1916, which it hadn't. In the 1940s, they embarked on an eco-migration, signaling that they saw a transformed Mennonite community in Canada as nothing more than an acquiescence to unfaithfulness. In the 1950s and 60s, stories trickled back to Canada of trouble in Mexico, as the most stubborn of these already recalcitrant people pulled up stake and moved ever farther south, first into the British Honduras rainforest, and then in marched larger numbers to the intemperate bushland of the Bolivian Oriente. And just as this migration to the southern southern ends of the earth ensued, thousands of others traveled in the very opposite direction, northward to return to Canada, quote unquote, usually as impoverished and dispossessed grapes of the wrath Mennonites into the heart of southern Manitoba. As the century turned, what might appear as a classic historic U-turn south from Western Canada in the 20s and then back up north to central Canada in the 70s became rather more complicated. The stories of poverty and ignorance in the south became fodder for a Canadian press, alongside stories of a seemingly perpetual migration leading to a fuzzy, seething village among nations stretching from far northern Crete south to the heart of the Argentine Pampa, east from the parkland of Northfield, Nova Scotia, to the semi-arid plain of western Kansas, and hundreds of places in between. And even as we speak, brand new places in the Quintaru, near the white beaches of Cancun, in Cuba, Bolivia, on the Argentine border, and on the very land vacated by their forebears south of Swift Current, Saskatchewan. How does one write this story into the history of Canadian Mennonites when it simply does not fit the bill? The fact is that even most of these 60,000 Low German, Mexico-oriented Mennonites in southern Ontario fall out of the trajectory of modernization or the liberal order for two reasons. First, most arrive in Canada with a commitment to avoid the signposts of modernization of transformed Canadian Mennonites, that is, life in medium-sized cities, institutions of higher education like Grebel, global agencies of development, the arts and the sciences. They remain Low German-speaking at home, assume a place as working-class folks in the fields and factories, finding their bearing in the transplanted old colony in Sommerfelder churches of the South. Secondly, because they do not hone nation-centric lives, and they patently don't want to be included in the story of transformed Canadian Mennonites. Their loyalty to Canada was minimal after their ancestors blamed it for yielding to the imperatives of British imperialism and attempting to force a militaristic English education onto a pacifist German children. Nevertheless, they continued to flirt with Canada. Having left the untrue north for the more predictable heathen south, they nevertheless kept their Canadian passports, dreamt of white Christmases in Canada, returned to it opportunistically, and abandoned it at whim. The Low German Mennonites are an Anabaptist group, not at the center of any nation's history. Canada is about immigrants coming, of cities growing, of middle class flourishing, of multicultural polity developing, of the ascendancy of a liberal order. It is not supposed to be a country of folks leaving, of passports held pragmatically, of global links over which Canada seems to have no control. But this nation-centric story of Canada, by definition, excludes groups that do not come to stay, or those who leave, or those who do not engage Canada in a kind of a Mennonite jig. And yet to exclude this reason alone, to my mind, is similar to exclude groups who in previous generations did not fit the presiding paradigms of their time. Indeed, in recent times, we have written into the history of Mennonites in Canada subjects because we have been open to borrowing ideas of critical analysis from the wider academy. Robert Zacharias' recent University of Manitoba Press book about the breaking point and writing about it, about Russlander and Canadian writers, has gained traction with the employment of concepts of diaspora and post-colonialism. And Conrad's recent Quarter Red Moon from the University of Press has entered a crowded field of family and autobiographical study of Soviet Mennonite life by employing methods of self-reflexivity. While Hans Werner's Constructed Mennonite, along similar lines, has made its mark by problematizing memory. By daring to employ class analysis for Mennonites, Janice Thiessen's University of Toronto Press book, Manufacturing Mennonites, has been able to address our refusal to acknowledge that, according to the watershed work of sociologists in the 70s, 25% of Mennonites in North America were working class, about equal numbers to those of business, professional, and agricultural classes. By borrowing from the cultural construction of gender analysis employed by third-generation Canadian women's historians, Marlene Knapp has added yet another, and one would hope a final nail in a coffin of the great white man's history of Mennonites, and produce a sophisticated rewrite of the Mennonites in Canada stories by inserting the word woman in the middle of that title. We have yet to see the fruit of a recent decision by the Mennonite Historical Society of Canada in January, just a month ago, to produce a volume in the next 5 years titled Mennonite Newcomers in Canada, focusing on the rapidly changing ethnic landscape of Mennonites in Canada since the 1970s, with a possible conference in 2017 on the 50th anniversary of the Society and the Vice President's let's all apply for that society. Other terms and concepts will surely show a new Canadian Mennonite history in time, especially if we as historians in Canada engage in such concepts as artifact and materiality and interspeciality, and there's other fancy terms we could apply. Now within the constellation of this critical analysis employed by the wider academy, I thought we could find a term that might bring back into the fold the Low German Mennonites. That concept, I think, is transnationalism. And in Village Among Nations, I lay out my hope that it can enliven and make more inclusive the story of Canadian Mennonites in the same way as diaspora and self-reflexivity and memory and class and gender have. The concept of transnationalism feeds off of a cultural studies approach that upsets old normative words of nation as a social construction that have their lifespan and set in their own set of cultural architects. The fact is that the nation-centered Mennonite story of the Mennonites in Canada series may have been required to critique denominationally centered histories of the past, that it too skews lived experiences. Quite ironically, to understand the story of Mennonites in Canada, we need to embrace the term transnationalism and understand it in its full complexity. And when we do, see it as much more than we are the trunk and you are the branches missions history, or a history of our links to the Mennonite World Conference, MEDA, Self-Help Crafts, or NCC Canada. In Village Among Nations, I try on this term of transnationalism, and think I find therein a concept that not only rescues Low German Mennonites, mostly old colonies, who bade Canada farewell in 1922, but now a place for the mentality, the theology, the folklore, that gave an intellectual and cultural undergirding to the story that still gives so many Canadian Mennonites pause, even discomfort. In it, I think we can find an old Anabaptist teaching of being strangers in this world, pilgrims and strangers, finds place of legitimacy alongside terms such as Anabaptist vision and politics of Jesus and lordship of Christ. Let me take you on a field trip of Village Among Nations to try to make this point. With the concept of transnationalism, quite suddenly, the idea of Old Colony Bishop Isaac M. Dick, when he recalled the heady days of 1916 to 1922, I think takes on new meaning. His concern was that the new English language school legislation of 1916 would do little more than produce, quote, an inextinguishable enthusiasm for the art of war. That it would lead Mennonite children to embrace the nation-centric mantra of, quote, one king, one country, one fleet, one flag, one all British Empire loved and sacrificed for the fatherland. Not just English, but what it represented. The migration to Mexico, Dick wrote, occurred in the best spirit of Anabaptist faithfulness, that is, in, quote, followers of Jesus were born into sorrow, suffering, and persecution, to walk in all humility and lowliness. Now this truly Anabaptist walk was, he wrote, the way of the forebears and the martyr's mirror, a pathway through and beyond nations to the only homeland the Christian can call home, eternal heaven. It was a transnational cosmology apparent also in the archived diary and memoirs of other migration leaders who wrote about this migration of 8,000 Mennonites from Western Canada to Paraguay and Mexico in the 1920s. Now similarly, the history of the immigrants who arrived in Mexico and Paraguay between 1922 and 1928 is not to hand off this story to Latin American historians. The fact is that the immigrants did not disappear from the Canadian cultural landscape. The Steinbach Post, a decidedly Canadian paper with a very small regional focus in southeastern Manitoba, quite suddenly catapulted into a newspaper of global reach, facilitating a transnational flow of information, tying the immigrants together with those who stayed. Letters in the Post during the first decade in the Global South recorded the dogged commitment of the settlers to trace lines on God's earth without any new national loyalty. And thus in May 1924, the Mexican press could herald the newcomers from Canada as walking in the footsteps of the national hero of Hernando Cortez, who marched inland in 1517 from Veracruz after destroying his ships as a sign of his determination to neither hesitate nor die. A welcome to Mennonites to join a Mexican mythology And the old colony newcomers said, no thanks, we don't want Cortez in our narrative. And their missives in signing the post describe transplanted villages and land tenure systems that were their very own. In fact, in May 1923, when a young Canadian traveler, P.K. Dirksen, visited the new Mexican colonies, he described the land, quote, so backwards, some of the people say it is 100 years behind, and with all the appearances of Bible times, here one rides on donkeys, walks barefoot, eats and sleeps on the ground. And still, he writes, quote, the Mennonites of Mexico seem to be very happy. When I asked, what should I relay to the people of Manitoba, their answer was, we are doing well, we are all happy, the Mexicans leave us entirely alone, only the plowing is hard. It was a similar situation in Paraguay where the 1700 settlers, with gondolas privilegium in hand, forged up the Paraguay River beyond the Asunción and past the northern river coast of Puerto Quesada into the Chaco, where, as one writer put it in 1927, the line cutters from our own people will help surveyors. The Mennonites would draw their own lines on God's earth. In the second decade, the 1930s, the Paraguayans may have settled in, welcoming the Fahrenheimers from the Soviet Union, aiding the Paraguayan assault on Bolivia, but in nostalgia-laden letters, they endlessly played the sweet image of the old Heimat, old Canada. The Mexico Mennonites, however, went further. They took the memories of Canada, and now in the 1930s, as the Mexico government betrayed them, unable to fully control Pancho Villa's disbanded forces from regularly robbing the Mennonites, and then much worse, closing the Mennonite schools for violating the Mexican Constitution, which they did, became overwhelmed by nostalgia for the old Heimat, and now especially its reputation for peace, order, and good government. But now that segment clashed bitterly with naysayers who saw not sweet Heimat, but sinister Vaterland, the hard fatherland that had betrayed them in 1916. And thus in May 1935, when Bernard Penner wrote to Mexico, he put the debate in transnational context. Quote, our danger here in Mexico has been much exaggerated and is not greater than that in Canada. Indeed, there it is worse. He had read about, quote, Bolsheviks, communists, and other demonstrators in Regina. He had read about demonstrations in the streets of Saskatoon, where the mounted police officers had been called in. And he had read about trouble in Ottawa at the Parliament buildings where machine gun fire apparently had broken all the windows. This is sorry we don't know that, but he knew that. And everywhere in Depression Canada, he says, one hears of dangerous dependence on relief. Now this is a German letter, and relief is in English. Relief. It's a bad word. Relief, leading to corruption and laziness. His conclusion imagined a transnational world. He says, I see danger here, I see Canada, and within the whole world. So further responses to these charges against life in Mexico, I intend to ignore completely. Canada's patriotic participation in the Second World War and the seemingly unilinear urbanization created the context of an eco-migration. The transnational nature of this migration is certainly noticeable in the flow of information back to Canada, now not only in German language papers, but in the two upstart English language media, Southern Manitoba's Altona Echo and the Carolina News, vehicles for northern gazes into the south, including voices of concern by an unlikely chorus of critics, including Canadian novelist W.O. Mitchell. What's he doing in Chaco? I'm not sure. Canadian sociologist Winfield Fraser-Owen, Canadian industrialist C.A. DeFer, U.S. historian H.S. Bender, and others. But as always, the compelling voices are those of the migrants themselves, and unlike the 1920s, the 1940s yielded a number of women biographers who gave migration a gendered rendition, nary a deferential term for father or healthster, I have to say, but myriad references to health, food, cleanliness, and especially place. One Western Saskatchewan writer may have self-identified as Frau Isaac F. Bergen, but this relocation to Paraguay is about herself and her family of 10 children, and yes, father, but it is not about Isaac or following Isaac. Mostly it is about a separation from her social sphere and rebuilding it in East Paraguay,
an aspect of transnational mindset immigration historian Dirk Herder dubs a transcultural phenomenon in a supranational world. Her 1948 account does reference a preacher who spoke at the Rosthern farewell service, but Bergen accentuates the emotion-laden hymns of separation, a hymn she says was titled As Lot and Abram Separated. Her concerns are not with finances or religion as much as the last lunch at Hildebrands and Rosthern when she wondered, when next will we drink so much milk? On the train to Montreal, the Volendam, the famous Volendam, to Buenos Aires, the riverboat up the Piranha to Asuncion, the truck into East Paraguay, the final 24 hours by ox cart and on foot, to their very own patch of grass at an imagined village bearing the name Waldheim. It was about the connection of one domestic space in Saskatchewan with another in the rainforests of South America. Along the way, she tries her best to replicate domestic space, appreciates hymn songs, frets about her children's health, grooms and cleans and lauds strong women. Aunt Dirk Klassen, a good mother and grandmother, encouraged her on that truck into East Paraguay. At Waldheim, however, at a place where, quote, the grass is not taller than my head, close to clear, wonderful water, she and her family came to a stop, and they spread a blanket on the ground and had their first lunch, immediately after which they pitched their 3 tents. On Monday morning, Bergen writes, it is usually a wash day on Mondays, but first food is to be secured, so I got up early before the others and baked biscuits. 2 dots in a nation-less world have been connected by biscuits. The story of the 1950s and 60s takes Mexico Oaxaca as farther south. British Honduras and Bolivia, and again the Canadian connection remains. Letters from the south still flood the Schleimer Post till it ceases publication in 1967, but another form of transnational flow of knowledge appears as in the outsider's gaze into the communities. Young Canadian and U.S. academics, doctoral and postdoctoral students, for one, follow the Mennonites into the south and offer their authoritarian analysis. But a new voice now arises within the south, where the national presses of the 2 countries offer overt apologias for the interloping white, German-speaking farmers in the midst of nationalism in the south. In British Honduras, the police billboard defended the Mennonites, not some ragtag group of, quote, Mexican workers, but a group of Mennonites of German origin whose ancestors left Russia in 1874 and who in 1922 migrated to the state of Chihuahua, Mexico from Canada. And now in 1958, they want nothing less 100,000 acres, quote, for their agriculture projects, which do nothing less than build up BH, British Honduras, export trade and agricultural products. A decade later in Bolivia, newspapers such as La Plaza El Diario carried similar defenses of the newcomers. The most elaborate by former military man, that's how Roberto Lamegre, after Cordova, sort of self-identifies. He writes an op-ed piece in El Diario. He sees Mennonite farming as nothing less than a military asset. Forward, quote, given the conditions of modern warfare, a country must till its uncleared lands, populating them and making them produce, or else you will lose the next war. Naysayers should know that countries in which Mennonites live, quote, in large number, the United States, Canada, and Paraguay, have all demonstrated their military strength. And pointedly, Paraguay, he insisted, had, quote, encouraged Mennonite colonization in Chaco, a factor certainly in Bolivia's historic defeat in the 1932 War of the Great Thirst. From the perspective of the South, the Mennonites were national assets, for sure, but plucked from elsewhere on the globe, and no matter that their religion forbade an embrace of national identity, they would raise the host society's international swagger. Beginning in the 1950s and then increasing in each decade until the end of the century, as many Mexico colonists who headed south came north instead of to work in Ontario's growing food industry, is a phenomenon captured by theorist Stephen Wertbeck's idea of a new transnationalism replacing an old version of the early 20th century, a shift reflecting a crescendoing globalized rural depopulation, faster technologies of travel, and more inclusive state policies. Canada's new multicultural policy and its numerous programs of 1971 is coincidental to this study for a major grant from the Multiculturalism Program in 1979 to Conrad Grebel College, where Ronald Swatsky, not Rodney Swatsky, Ronald Swatsky, a religious studies grad at that time, to undertake an extensive oral history project among Old Colony Mennonites who had arrived from Mexico and Ontario as early as 1951. Among the 48 interviews that he conducted, and that Maureen can guide you to the brand new archives, they're all in Low German, so brush up on that dialect, he discovered a particular collective memory of old-timers who recalled leaving Western Canada in the 1920s as children, sojourning in poverty-stricken Mexico and coming northward to a strange new place called Ontario in uncertain circumstances. Anna Peters, who left Grebel, Manitoba for Mexico at age 7 with her parents in 1922, says on those tapes, quote, she remembers well farm life in Manitoba and recalls the last evening in Manitoba when we were waiting for the train and how thirsty I was. And the train trip itself, with my father, I would tend to the animals in the livestock car, and it would stop for periodics during the in the U.S. Midwest. And even hearing that the reason for it all was that the church, the preachers were committed to running their own schools in our own language. 32 years later, 1954, after a generation of privation on, quote, but a small patch of land, she recalled the 12-day return organized by an unscrupulous Mennonite, quote, on a truck with a tarp tied over the top with more than 40 people, 5 families, each with 7 or 8 children, the truck box completely full from corner to corner, and then in misery in Ontario, living illegally in a condemned, boarded-up old brick house until friendly Port Rowan, Rusklin Mennonites came to rescue them with, quote, stoves and clothing, bed frames and food, and avenues to soybean, tobacco, and tomato and field work, as, quote, none of us had anything. A generation later, Carrie Fass was here, a religious studies grad student at the University of Toronto, conducted several dozen interviews of Old Colony Mennonite women in southern Ontario, and now a new phenomenon is clearly perceptible. Northern Mexico had always been in striking distance of Canada, but improved roads and hard technologies now turned 12-day road trips into 3-day affairs, and now, more often, as repeated seasonal trips. Of the couple dozen interviews, and with Elizabeth Wemble, a pseudonym, was typical. Elizabeth was the oldest child, age 7, when her family left Zacatecas Estate in about 1982. After a summer of field work, they returned to Mexico to auction off their belongings and came back north the following summer, intending on permanence in Ontario, but that then at age 18, Elizabeth was compelled by her parents to join them back in Mexico, where she had once married a fellow Old Colony Mennonite, and together they moved to Canada yet a 3rd time. And only for a short time, as, quote, my parents were down there and I had relatives there, nostalgia. And then when Mexico could not sustain them, they fled to Kansas to work as undocumented ranch hands for 2 years. And then, quote, desiring somewhere without fear that they'll be deported, quote, end quote, and a permanent place for kids to grow up, they moved to Canada the 4th time. And each of these moves were what we call as simply terrible. The move back to Mexico at age 18 was especially difficult, and it was just so hard trying to adjust. She says she wanted to stay in Canada at the time, but, quote, mother wouldn't have any of it. She's like, no way, you're coming with us. You're not of age yet, and you have to stay with us until you're at least 20. In 1977, Mennonite Central Committee launched an ambitious project to attempt to replicate an old medium, a regular newspaper in the vein of the Steinbach Post, that had ended its publication in 1967. The MCC-sponsored newspaper, Die Mennonite Post, was an instant hit, and within just 6 years published 8,000 letters from half a dozen countries that held a Low German diaspora, not including Canada, the US, Mexico, Belize, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Argentina. The letters spoke to the transnational nature of this community, an imagined village superimposed on the Western Hemisphere, linking hundreds of close-knit places. They spoke of regular travel, of nostalgia for old Heimats, of planned relocations to unsettled regions, of how a pragmatic citizenship was conceptualized when allowing for migration without social association. But crucial for the idea of writing history into Canadian history. The Post also became the platform for an extraordinary conversation, a transnational flow of information across space, and a significant cultural divide, a conversation across a divide. It linked accommodating old colony Mennonites in Ontario and southern Manitoba and southern Alberta as well, with their second and third cousins in South America, including the most reclusive of the Lutheran Mennonites, the old colony horse and buggy Mennonites, mostly of Bolivia, but also East Paraguay, Argentina, Belize, and Mexico. In the Post, the most communitarian, oftentimes the least polished of the immigrant writers, those in Latin America, articulated a culture hitherto rooted in orality, while the most acculturated of the writers residing in Canada announced their own reformed cosmologies, ones comfortable with the wider world's upward mobility, symbolic ethnicity, even a paternalistic altruism, sometimes in a white man's burden language, an appellation that is also an invitation to celebrate their accommodation to wider society. Here were two groups who engaged the Post in diametrically different ways, but by doing so, nevertheless introduced opposing cosmologies to one another. The traditionalist horse and buggy guys, refusing electronic communication of radio and television, used the newspaper to connect with their other similarly minded Mennonites in the diaspora and seemed happy to turn the writings into tools of opposing modernity. The more accommodating, also searching to restore frayed social networks, used the newspaper for the very opposite end to embrace and announce significant degrees of modernity. Certainly one of the unexpected developments in this launch of this newspaper was that the horse and buggy Mennonites actually joined this conversation. And although their mental travels often took them to imagine borders of the dispersed old colony community, they did engage progressive quarters. And thus Abram Bandman of Las Piedras in Bolivia, having described his own life as a middle-aged poor man in 1988, he says he works in the mornings in the cheese factories and in the afternoons in the repair shop. He says there's always something to do here if you want to, quite abruptly announced, quote, and so now I wish to take a road trip. And so he greeted his children in Ontario, that is, right, his ex-horse and buggy children, the in-laws in Tabor, ex-old colonists, and then friends in the jungles of Belize in East Paraguay. In either case, the writers rarely moved beyond the mundane, who died, who married, who preached, how was the weather, but in the very act of writing, an oral culture is turned into text, one opening up the exclusive community to outside scrutiny. For in the process of sharing even the mundane, they articulate a pretty clear worldview. Inadvertently, the letters told of the religious values that constituted the inside story of the old colonist mindset. They spoke about trust or fatalism that shaped everyday life, of joy linked to rainfall and unhappiness to doubt, of death and life, always divinely determined. The letters also articulated a culture of religious obedience, adherence to the sacred ecclesiastical ordinal, the teaching that undergirded the most visible features of the old colonist faith. They spoke of the ordinal as a matter of course, as if addressed to encourage the like-minded or confess inadequacies to fellow congregants. And these utterances were coupled with rather naive expressions of love that corresponded to the teachings of mutual submission, references to loving God and beloved Eltesta and our beloved mother are mentioned numerous times. Related to this cosmology was a biblically referenced identity of pilgrim and stranger, folks not quite at home in the world. And oftentimes the letters hinted at uncertain citizenship and worry that the venerated privilegium, the legal guarantee or privileges of private schools, military exemptions might yet be stripped by hostile governments. Now together, the four components of their faith outlined here, faith, obedience, love, and pilgrimage, shaped the old colonists' interaction with other Mennonites in the wider diaspora, as well as interactions across borders within their countries. They spoke of their neighbors and host society in terms of always reinforced social boundaries. The pacifist, German-speaking Mennonites against the stranger, the Spanish speaker who did not understand or respect Mennonite pacifism, the Catholics who could do carnival one day and go to Mass the next, the government agent who couldn't understand why Mennonites would reject state aid. And very occasionally, these letters contested the world's, well, actually more than occasionally, their acculturated kin in the wider world, but oftentimes in a language of humor and sarcastic, self-deprecating, and the ironic. Hence, Jacob M. Lieb in 1982 wondered, quote, if the people who had sent their money out of the country so that moth and rust might not consume them know for sure that Canada is without rust. And Cornelius Harms in 1987, wondering why car-driving brothers Johann and David Harms don't have more time to write. He says, I would have thought that you might have more time now that you can drive so much faster than can a horse and buggy, or have you simply assembled more businesses? Now, there's numerous examples of this, and despite their desire to be left alone, the old colonists, horse and buggy Mennonites, did engage this wider world, and in these conversations with kin or like-minded co-religionists, they articulated that particular worldview. Now, the letters from accommodating Low German Mennonites who had returned to Canada from places in the south differed remarkably from the old colony stalwarts in the south. The distances are farther and the transnational interaction more frequently, and those in Canada spoke often with emotion of expensive trips or hope for trips to the far south to visit kin. Usually they wrote deposited greetings that connected more than one place, sometimes 5, once 11 different places in 6 different countries. Numerous letters were merely travelogues, friendly and simply collegially, and sometimes paternalistic, referencing some exotic elements of quotidian life in the south that they had seen. Many shared perspectives on economic struggle in the poorer, more fledgling communities of the south, and sometimes these letters were mailed in by Canadian Mennonites with no history within the Low German Mennonite diaspora that traveled south from a position of authority, knowledge, and security to provide aid or education. Other reports spoke more specifically of Canadian sojourning in the south in order to assist the Low German Mennonites, including evangelical missionaries who, in keeping with the tenor of the post, spoke a language of social concern and aid, not in the word missionary language. Similar reports from Canadians observing return migrants within Canada were also frequently published. Aside from editorials by progressive Mennonites on the economic and social state of the returned migrants, myriad letters from the migrants themselves fill the post columns under the provincial headings of Alberta, Manitoba, Ontario, occasionally British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and Nova Scotia. The letters invariably describe life in Canada and sometimes the struggle to assimilate to modern ways in new places and strange economies. For some of the moves northward marked constant travel, summer employment in Canada, winter sojourn in Mexico. For others, it marked a certain degree of success and elementary upward mobility within a world of wage labor, linguistic acculturation, embrace of public schools, the very schools their ancestors had rejected. The Canadian immigrants also express a comfortable cultural accommodation, seen most pointedly in what came to be known as Treffen days, literally meeting days, in which hundreds of Low German immigrants, mostly from Mexico and Paraguay, gathered to eat ethnic foods that combine Russian and Latin American cuisines, hear speeches of yesteryear, and simply be reacquainted with old friends. Other letters merely hinted at the lure of Canada's climate and social safety net. Certainly some immigrants complained about Canada's cold winters. They also heralded its verdant, well-watered environment. Occasionally its first snowfall. Some even wrote of a practice common among cash-strapped carriers of Canadian passports in the south that is heading to Canada for medical treatment. Just as occasional letters from the south criticized northern acquiescence to capitalist or consumer culture, these letters from the north sometimes were critical of authoritarian old colony church leaders and reckless anti-modernism in the south. But the two sets resembled one another in that the respective cosmologies were spoken without reference to one another, but with seeming knowledge that they existed nevertheless. In conclusion, by borrowing the methods of a wider historical discourse, Mennonite history has often been given a broader, more inclusive mandate. Certainly discoveries of new sources has invigorated Mennonite history, as has simply allowing current issues of concern in the Mennonite community to guide research into the past in a search for antecedents to current issues. But borrowing new theoretical methods from the wider world has promised similar results. Just as the very idea of a nation-centric model based on implicit engagement with the theories of modernization recall the words separate, struggle, and transform transformed, so too, later generation historians now engaging the methods of social history and also cultural studies have found avenues of writing more iterations of the Mennonite experience into the narrative of Mennonites in Canada. Ironically, one of these concepts, that of transnationalism, allows for the inclusion of our national narrative of a very large, rapidly growing, reticent, low German population of Ontario and its Canadian passport close kin of the Americas. Transnationalism takes us out of the binary of Canada versus the US, away from the sometimes forced connection between Ontario and Western Canada, and allows for the flow of information across national borders for the transcultural or supranational identities of villagers among the nations. Perhaps it can also suggest for us a way to conceptualize a community whose story has too often been filtered by well-intended missionaries and professionals who produce narratives of social pathology to justify projects that they themselves have started. Finding ways to analyze the nature of a community for the sole purpose of understanding how it has survived, adapted, reinvented itself should always be a central mission of a historian. Writing the account of the Low German Mennonite diaspora into the fabric of the Canadian Mennonite story can perhaps identify this account of a village among nations as part of the story of our village within this nation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Roy. And those of you who were here last night know that the way we're going to proceed now is that Steve will make the first response to the presentation, after which Roy will respond to him, and then we'll open it up for some questions, after which will be our reception. So please, Steve.
Thank you. Well, I enjoyed this paper quite a lot a few days ago when Roy emailed it to me, and I read it then, and then hearing it again this evening. And so I picked up different things this evening, hearing it, than what I had thought when I read it the first time. So a lot here. Just make a couple comments, and then I have a few questions, I guess, is what way we'll do this. So starting from the beginning of the paper, and some of the observations on the difficulty in taking a story that doesn't fit the master narrative and what to do with that. I remember conversations that we had when we were when we were in the early stages of working together on the Seeking Places of Peace book, and realized that even just numerically, as we were including the folks that I was talking about this evening, or Amish folk who I was talking about last night, that we were any of the story that meant that in the last 20 to 30 years, the North American Mennonite story was actually becoming more rural and whiter, and that wasn't the story that that wasn't the story that had been expected in our particular Mennonite groups, in which the story had been one of urbanization and ethno-racial diversity. And so just trying to decide thinking about what that meant, or what to do with that. So I thought about that again as I was reading this paper. But particularly obviously the theme of transnationalism is, I think, the major contribution here that Roy's making this evening, and a very helpful one. From the standpoint of immigration history, both Canada and the U.S., the image that I associate with historian Walter Nugent, maybe there's other people who have used this image also, but he says, when we have a nation-centered history, we think about immigration as somehow filling up our bowl with population, and actually immigration is much more of a process of holding a sieve. So people are arriving and leaving all at the same time, and we should think about immigration with this image of a sieve. And I mean, it's between a quarter and a third of the people who arrived in the United States between 18 1990 and 1930 did not remain permanently. And many of those who left multiple times because they arrived multiple times. So on any given day, Ellis Island, when you ask someone from Italy, have you been here before? They would say, yes, like last year, or 2 years ago, and they were engaged in this kind of cycle of movement from Italy to the United States and back again, and sometimes from Italy to the United States to Argentina, to Italy to the United States to Argentina. And so these, for those of us who have remained in myself, family, was more or less in one place for a fairly long period of time. It's an important reminder for me that the process of immigration is not just a one-time event. It's something that my family story is in global terms exceptional for having crossed borders once and then more or less remained there long term. Questions that I have. So one big question and then a briefer question. Question about the importance of place in this transnational framework. Are some places more important than others? And if so, why? So this is it's helpful for me to think about the multiple places, and there's not one place, and so on. But when we talk about memories of and references to the Altheimat, did that always refer to Canada? Is the Old Heimat sometimes the Russian Empire? Is it sometimes Mexico for those in the Middle East? Where is the Old Heimat that people may be pined for? Is it always in Canada? And if so, why? What does that say about Canada's relationship to all these other places? So what places are more important than others and why? And then second, and this is maybe an easier question, not really, well, easier because I know you've addressed this before. So to someone maybe hearing this and thinking, okay, here we've heard a case for the importance of considering Low German Mennonites as important to the Mennonite story and to the Mennonite story in Canada. Is your presentation too idealistic? What is it that we can learn from these people? So I know you've thought about that before, and maybe say a bit about that.
So the Heimat? Yeah, it's Heimat, of course, means right homeland, but it's kind of a sweet version of that. It's from a theorist whose name I've now forgotten. Who talks about Heimat is the sweet homeland when you feel nostalgic for your old place, and Vaterland is when you feel a sense of betrayal and hostility to the place from which you came. And so that Canada is the Heimat that seems to always be there. And I'm not sure exactly why it's Canada, not, Bolivians writing about Mexico and so on. Partly because I think in both cases, and this might be what happens when you look at a particular source, right? So the Steinbach Post, the Steinbach Post and the Mennonite Post, the Mennonite Post are both Canadian-based papers, and the assumption is when you write to them, you are in a sense engaging your kin who stayed back in Canada. And so, yeah, I remember where my cradle stood, in the rural municipality of Richard, where our house was, and this northeast corner, and they'll do this kind of, they do that kind of thing. And keep in mind that these folks, even though many have been in South America for more than two generations, given Canada's very liberal citizenship policies, I think up to the third generation could carry Canadian passports if they sort of register the kids in particular ways and so on. So they're Canadians. Strangely enough, we've forgotten about them, but they think of themselves as Canada. What we can learn from them? Oh man,
Well, do we want to feel guilty when we learn from them, or do we want to feel good about when we learn from them? There's actually a letter in the Shema Plus, no, the Membership Plus guy says, yeah, we old colonists always say we should obey our parents, but that's not necessarily a good thing. I mean, if your parents allow the cattle to wander around the cornfield and you're following their example, that's not good. So you've got to be selective in what you're going to actually learn. So the same thing. So what can we learn from them? Well, one thing that my grandfather was part of this diaspora. 1950, my grandfather Isaac Loewen, my grandmother Maria, she didn't like the city, moved to Mexico, and my grandfather said, I observed kids are going to high school, women are cutting their hair and jewelry and stuff, we got to get out of Canada, it's getting too worldly, and we've got to move to Mexico, and that's not the only reason we should move to Mexico. We should move to Mexico because it is wrong for a Christian to become too comfortable in one country, right? We are not nation-centric people, right? So Anabaptists, we as Anabaptists have talked about service, we've talked about advocacy for underprivileged groups, we've talked about nonviolence and so on. But we often address patriotism and nationalism, and these guys would say, you guys in Canada have, lost out to a nation-centric perspective. We are pilgrims and strangers in this world, and so we can denounce them as being opportunistic, carrying Canadian passports. For the sake of Canadian passports, they would say, what's opportunistic about that? This is a tool to get me across borders. And, so whatever, do we want to, I think we've gotten a little bit too comfortable in this country, so maybe we could all up and go to Bolivia for a couple of days.
Other questions, please?
You talk about leading cosmologies, and I'm wondering if you could describe or talk more about that, particularly about the old colony cosmology. Maybe there's a leading question, but is it in some way a medieval cosmology?
Yeah, the way you think about life and see the universe and what you consider to be right and wrong and so on. And so the way they see that question is often diametrically opposed to the way we see that question, right? You send your kids to Grebel, your grandkids to Grebel, so that they'll get upper mobility and get good jobs and be able to afford a house in the suburbs and occasional summer vacations in the south and so on and so forth, and marry nice Christian spouses and have 2.3 kids. And they say, no, that's not, that's exactly everything you hold to be good and true. We actually don't think is good, right? We think it's good to be primitive and not know a lot and live together close to nature, and don't try to regulate how many kids you have and so on. And so there's two different worldviews. It's not that we have a worldview and they don't have a worldview. They certainly have they very much have a worldview. And what happens often, and I'm sure this is a question that Steve gets all the time with regard to the Amish, is how do you explain, that they're so primitive and how can they stay so, close within their communities? And it is because, as Andy sort of hints at, that in some ways they are, the way I sometimes try to define it, to people who actually think Catholics are okay, this works. For those, I've tried it sometimes, and he said, yeah, well, of course they're Catholics. But in a sense, they're a monastic order, right? And this is Michael Zappa, this is Arnold Snyder's. Michael Zappa comes out of the prior of St. Peter's, some abbey who I've forgotten, and he translates his monastic sort of vows into the Schleitheim Confession and says this is actually for an entire community, and so we can look at them in a sense today. Their vows of baptism are more sacred than their marriage vows. The vows of baptism is absolutely a vow to stay with the old colony ordnung, right? Simplicity, and the way simplicity is defined by the community. And we may sort of balk at, their triad of evils, right? The rubber tire, the truck, and the power line are the three things to watch out for. But they would say, well, there's other things that could be added to that, and there's a reason for every one of these, although they don't necessarily want to talk about the reasons. They're not really geared well to sort of giving explanations for why they do things. They say, we are people of praxis. We do things. we follow, and so in that sense, it's kind of like, what I understand, I mean, Andy was writing a whole PhD dissertation on this, but the idea of poverty that is actually intentional, right? MCC, goes down there, and I love MCC guys, and I donate to MCC and so on. But over the years, it's often like, we need to help these guys, become stronger economically, which often means, why are they so primitive? Why do they have steel wheels in their tractors, right? Get rid of the steel wheels. Put rubber tires in the tractors, you can grow more corn. And these guys say, no, we don't want to grow more corn, right? But you understand that what we're doing here is intentional. We intentionally, like, you said, what's wrong with the cell phone? It's too handy. Oh, what's wrong with handy? Handy is a slippery slope, right? So you don't want stuff handy, right? And so these are things that perplex us, but they say, just as, again, a monastic order is intentional poverty, theirs is intentional poverty.
Yes, very good.
I'm just going to go for it. I'm very fortunate to work with Anabaptist communities in Ontario, and something that we see more and more is a very frequent migration between South America and coming back, almost on a seasonal basis with some communities. And I'm wondering, to what extent is the idea of transnationalism even appropriate when it seems to be a largely migratory population at this point? There's very little, in some families, very little sense of a home base.
Yeah, in fact, transnationalism, I think, was a concept that was first developed by some folks who were actually studying, this is not a Mennonite term, right? It was something we borrowed from the wider academy with reference to an international labor market with folks who, in fact, somehow, where is home? And they seem to be constantly moving around, or oftentimes they have two homes. And so, I mean, a typical example of a transnational family might be a Chinese family, moves from Hong Kong to Vancouver, and they set up a home in Vancouver, and they set up the wife and the children, send them to school there, and then the father goes back and carries on a business. Or other versions of transnationalism, often the undocumented workers from Mexico, they go to the U.S. and they go back and forth and so on. Most often, I sense that they do have sort of points on Earth, to which they return, right? And so, I mean, I've seen this. I've seen half constructed houses in Durango State by folks who are in Ontario. They're earning enough money here. I mean, you can clear $20,000 in the summer here with 8 kids working in the tobacco fields, and then they go back and in winter they continue working on that house. So I've seen a lot more of that than people who don't have any sense of belonging. And they all carry mental networks. They know they have a cousin in Tabor, Alberta, in Crete, Alberta, in Campeche, in southern Mexico, and East Paraguay, and so on. And so they sometimes do, I think, follow that sort of kinship network. But from my experience, and your experience might be different, they do have a kind of sense of home, even though it is dispersed.
I'm a bit mystified by your linking a Low German with the old former Mennonites.
Linking, I'm sorry?
Speaking of Low German. I speak Low German, I drive a car.
Yeah.
Okay. So now, non-Low German speaking people, I can plug it.
Yeah, between the plucky schmocken. And that's a really good point, right? Just because you speak Low German, are you one of these Low German Mennonites? It's a term I think that MCC has borrowed. The problem is that earlier they have been talking about Canadian Mennonites, right? So who are the Low German Mennonites that I am speaking about, and we've defined as Low German, are folks who left Canada in the 1920s, moved to Mexico, Paraguay, and then entered into a century-long sort of set of migrations within the Western Hemisphere. Now, that's how I sort of define it for the purpose of this paper, but you're absolutely right. There's all kinds of folks here. How many of you speak Low German? Can actually say, right? Say, well, yeah, we've done the same Low German. And some of you may have Mexico roots, but many of you don't. And So, yeah, it's a problem with, earlier I think the MCC had the word Canadier, which didn't really work either, right? Because the Canadier is, of course, these guys who came to Manitoba in the 1870s, and then went on to Saskatchewan, et cetera, and some Russlander MCC guys, I think, said, the guys in the south, they're called Canadier. And I was at the chair of the MCC Manitoba board for 1 year at some point. I think we moved away. I think that's why it was only 1 year. It wasn't my confidence, I think. I remember objecting to the term Canadier. So why do you have a Canadier Concerns Committee? I'm a Canadier. What's your concern about me? I said, if we're going to have a Canadier Concerns Committee for the guys in Mexico, then we should have a Russlander Concerns Committee to look at drug abuse at Westgate Collegiate. Anyway, so, yeah, I should define my terms more precisely.
There's a question back there. Do you have the mic?
So I was thinking about a nation state, which is something that we consider to be so permanent, but it's really a relatively new concept. Because then I hear we have these transnational groups, and it's almost like it's the thorn in the paw of the great lion, right? These little groups kind of say, well, no, we operate differently. Is there any way that transnational groups shape policy currently, or shape ideas of the nation state that could actually maybe somehow affect how we think of the nation state?
Yeah, that's good. It's a really good question, and folks like Ernest Gellner and Eric Hobsbawm and so on have written about that. Yeah, I mean, there's a guy called Benedict Anderson that every grad student has to memorize called The Mansion in the Village, right? Is that Jeremy? Is that right? That Mansion? Thank you. He knows his stuff. It's just a test. And basically, yeah, the idea of the nation state is a relatively new phenomenon in the history of human beings, about 200 years ago, right? Canada is an older country than Germany. Did you know that? I mean, so it's like, so the idea of a nation state is something that Christians had to grapple with relatively recently, even though we think of these things are sacrosanct. And of course, we always try to make the nation state older than it really is. Remember the War of 1812 ads that our current Prime Minister spent some of your dollars on, and that 30-second clip, in 1812 our country was invaded, right? Well, we didn't have a country in 1812. So Canada, get some of your Canadian history, right? If you're going to talk about Canadian history, 1867, and invaded by whom, right? And it was part of the sideshow in a war of imperialism on the high seas between Britain and the nation power of the United States, and so on. So what's a nation state? And surely, right, the nation state may come to an end at some point. That same, incidentally, that same bishop in Lacrete, Alberta, who said he wasn't going to answer any of my questions because he didn't want his story to be part of Steve and my book, because they'd gone to Lacrete in the 1930s to get away from worldly Mennonites and didn't want to remind anybody where they were. And I said, okay, so what am I going to talk about now? I said, so can we forget that? Can we talk about your church? No, sure, good questions. We'll talk about the church, but I don't want to be part of your story. I said, so do you have a lot of young people that stay in your church? She said, no, I'd rather not answer that question. That was pretty non-threatening. I said, okay, good. Well, then let's talk about politics, right? The U.S. had just invaded Iraq, and so we're talking about politics. And all she says, hey, by the way, you're a learned man. Tell me, this George Bush going to Iraq, is that part of the world government thing we're reading about in Revelation? Right, well, hey, you're calling George Bush the Antichrist. I mean, that's your prerogative. But I sure wish I had that on tape. So, why are we going on here? Oh yeah, yeah, we're reading the nation state's coming to an end at some point, and so we won't have this problem anymore. Canada allows dual citizenship, right? They didn't, I think the US did at some point, they didn't, so in a sense, nations are reinventing themselves, and we see borders change, and is Crimea part of Russia? We're asking that question now, and so apparently those borders were sacrosanct, what? Because, well, we could go on and on. Any other questions?
Okay,
This has been a really rich feast, so let's thank them and then I'll give you some more. You'll have a chance to have conversations with them and with each other in the reception, which is down in the atrium. A couple of things about that reception. There will be a book table there, and so you'll be able to buy books, you will be able to have them signed. You will have good food, which we always have here. You will notice that there's still some construction machinery there. It's sort of walled off a little bit, and as I mentioned last night, it occasionally has a sign on it saying this is not a modern art exhibit. These are construction implements, and I guess they'll be there for a little while longer. One of the really good things that's going to happen for you this evening is Lorraine has agreed to open the library. So for those of you who are participating in the reception, you'll be able to go upstairs, look at the library. Will they have any access to looking at what's going to be the archives or just the library?
Maybe if they ask me nicely.
Well, give us a clue of what that would involve. Anyway, so we'll share food, we'll have conversation together, and you can see some of the new facilities that many of you have helped to support. We're very grateful. Thank you for joining us. Let's